The Solar Podcast is brought to you by Continental Energy Solutions. I'm Tim Montague, your host. Today on the Solar Podcast, pollinator friendly solar and agrivoltaics. My guest today is Mike Kiernan. He is the founder of an organization called Be the Change. Welcome to the show, Mike.
Thanks, Tim. Thanks for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
Well, thank you for reaching out to me and for being a listener of the show. I, as you know, am super passionate for pollinator friendly solar and agrivoltaics, and it's a burgeoning part of the industry. So I look forward to learning more about your work and what's going on in the Northeast. Give our listeners some background on yourself and how you got into solar.
Fantastic. I'm a physician and worked for 20 years on and off in Haiti, and worked in an innovation design program at Middlebury College and with the School of the Environment at Middlebury College. And about 6 years ago, as a new chapter in life was opening, and all of this solar was getting put in around Vermont, and people had very animated ideas and reactions to it. Thought that maybe there was an opportunity to tell a second story in these spaces, because people in Vermont, as in Illinois and a lot of other parts of the Midwest and the rest of the country, have this sense that landscape should be a working landscape or a natural landscape, if it can't be both. And if it comes into something like solar and you're driving by it for 90 seconds, people have all kinds of very decided opinions, especially in Vermont. And so that's when we started, was 2015. And we did our first pollinator habitat in a solar field there just south of Middlebury, Vermont. And now we've got close to 30 fields. We're all in the Northeast. We have some in different states, but we're mostly concentrated in Vermont. And, have created enough habitat now. We say that we've created habitat equivalent to every Vermont household building an 8x8 pollinator garden, and they should too.
Yeah, as I was saying to you a couple weeks ago when we first connected, we have a phenomenon here in Champaign-Urbana of pollinator gardens that the city has codified, so to speak, so that you can have a very wild looking yard. AHJs don't like it if your yard gets too weedy and gnarly. But if you plant the right plants, of course, it can be habitat for birds and bees and butterflies and other insects and pollinators. And the same goes for solar. We of course can plant a solar field in many different things. The worst case scenario would be turf grass, and then you have to mow it on a regular basis, and that has a footprint, right? And you may have to use weed killers and whatever to keep it looking nice, so to speak. But here in Illinois, we have a robust pollinator checklist, and I think Minnesota was on the cutting edge of that, and we've learned from what's going on in Minnesota. And every region needs their own approach, because soils and wildlife and plant mixes and the climate is different in different parts of the country, so every region needs their own approach. But give us some more background on what is going on in Vermont around pollinator friendly in general. Uh, you obviously are one of several organizations working on this topic. Who are your peers, and how are things trending?
The interesting thing is, when we started 6 years ago and I described what we were up to, people would look at us like we were crazy, which we are. But there was also a sense that, why is any of that necessary? And I think that we are still on just a sort of cusp of awareness of why pollinators are important. And that's sort of being led by ambassador species like the monarch and the honeybee. And the honeybee is an interesting one because it's not a native pollinator, and it's got lots of problems of its own, as you've heard about. But the native bee species, the native beetles and flies, the migratory ones like the monarch, these are the ones which we need to encourage the diversity of. And what I would say is the biggest trend in the 6 years since we started is that it's a much shorter trip to get people to understand why that's important now. And that's fantastic, because the time frame for doing this is narrowing, which is to say we're losing pollinator species. There's two previous podcasts you've done, which I recommend to your listeners, that are fantastic. One is Rob Davis, who's one of the most literate people in the country on the subject, out of Fresh Energy in Minnesota. The other is Tom Karras, whose organization, Meadville, has been doing this forever. And these are two really knowledgeable people to listen to on the subject. To come at it a little bit from the physician's perspective, you know, when I'm in Haiti, 1 in every 4 people I see has a micronutrient deficiency. And so that's just part of life in that part of the world. And you imagine what's going to happen with the growth in population that we're going to see in the next 2.5 decades and get to 10.5 billion people, that there is going to be 8 billion people living in the less developed parts of the world, where their diet is going to be limited by those things which are pollinator dependent. And certain of the vitamins and micronutrients that they need are going to be deficient if we continue to lose pollinators. And so the UN agency on the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, which is the IPBES, IPBES, has a summary that they've produced as 2 different studies, one in 2016, one in 2019. The executive summaries of those I recommend to everybody, I mean, every citizen, because understanding what happens if we lose the pollinators, which we are, at an accelerating rate, which we are, in terms of the micronutrients in our diet, because most of the things that are carbohydrates in our diet are wind pollinated, but those nutrients that our nutrition requires for growing a child, for pregnant mothers, for young children, these are things which are going to become threatened and are becoming threatened. And so instead of, say, 25% of the population of Haiti having a folate deficiency, folate is a chemical which helps us build DNA, with consequences. It has consequences in growth and physical vigor and intellectual vigor and even brain development. And if we have 25% of the population of these parts of the developing world become 50%, we'll have 4 billion people living with disabilities related to micronutrients. It's the most addressable public health crisis that's looming before us. We love the renewable sector and salute them because they get it. They get that big picture question of why do we need to have solar there? Why do we need to put wind over there? They get that consumption of energy, change of climate connection, which is part of the big picture, but it's not the entirety of the big picture, Tim. The entirety of the big picture includes what's going to happen with populations and nutritional sources if we don't take the opportunity to do the absolutely sensible thing of looking at that space and say, why not also address another important addressable problem? And that's where I think we're finding in the years since we started, that's gone from a big lift to people saying that's absolutely sensible. Why the hell would we not do that? And so more and more, our problem is a sense of momentum, and can we do this fast enough, and can we grow with people, and building people and getting more organizations like us involved. We don't have the ambition that Be the Change of doing every field. We have the ambition of every landscaping company in America having a little division that does pollinator habitat.
Yeah. The statistic I'm familiar with is that 75% of our foodstuffs are related to insects or pollinators. And so I mean, especially insects, right, are collapsing globally. The number of species is declining rapidly. And you mentioned monarch butterflies. So they're a charismatic species that is in harm's way, most likely due to human development and humans pumping toxic chemicals into the environment. But how does this relate to micronutrients? What are the foodstuffs specifically that you're referring to and trying to get the less developed world or low income people access to?
So that's where we actually are working on programs to develop roadside pollinator habitat in Haiti, and we have 2 other efforts we're just at the initiation of in Costa Rica and Puerto Rico on coffee plantations. And but the idea is this can't just happen here. This has got to scale, and the scaling means we've got to take a look at everywhere where there's turf grass, including our lawns, and say, why is this the way we express our dominion over the landscape with this monoculture? Why is it not just a lawn path, through a pollinator habitat. But it's true that the fourth grader today is seeing 35% fewer butterflies than their parents did, and 50% fewer than their grandparents did. And so it's not a linear rate, it's accelerating. So that by the time that fourth grader has grown up and has given birth to a child who becomes a fourth grader, at the time we'll have about 10 billion people on Earth, there are going to be so few butterflies, it's just going to be the cabbage white and the sulfur, the ones that make their living off of, human uh, uh, agricultural things, pests, basically. And the rest of them will be of historical interest, like dinosaurs. And that's sort of foretold already by what's happening, but it's not irreversible. And the thing we are rigorous about is, everything you try and do when you're trying to mess with habitat, a certain modesty should descend, because over and over again, we hear stories of us trying to fix something so intricate as an ecosystem and messing it up utterly. And so we have rigorous ways of measuring, are we creating successful habitat for pollinators? And the interesting thing is, it totally validates by studies. We have the University of Vermont here has a Gund Institute who we're working with doing research, and they're mostly focused on bees, but we're looking at all the different pollinators. And we survey a field by an approach from the Xerces Society, which is another organization I recommend to you, XERXES, Xerces, and XERCES. I'm sorry, I've forgotten how you spell your organization. It was named after a butterfly in California that didn't make it, but they have a lot of useful monographs on how you could create your own pollinator habitat, or how you could do this approach to a roadside. And they're a great source of information. So they have a validated by the literature approach to surveying for unique pollinator encounters. And it means, I won't go through the method, but it means there's a method. And 3 points in the season, we walk through each of our fields and we watch for unique pollinator encounters. Trying to find a nice day like today, which it is in Vermont, sunny, windless if possible, warm, and then we count and we see what's different. And most of our fields, especially an old cornfield, will have 7 unique pollinators in 15 minutes. And within a year, you'll have 170. And within 2 years, you'll have 280 to 300. And the most verdant meadow you've ever walked through at the height of the summer, like a shampoo commercial with butterflies going every which way, is 325 pollinators in 15 minutes. And so we are rigorous about validating it. And that's, I think, a really important thing to talk about when you're doing this. How do you know that you're successful doing it?
So, I can talk all day long about combining pollinator-friendly habitat and energy facilities, and we should talk more about that. But I don't understand the connection to micronutrients
Okay.
for humanity.
Absolutely. So if you look at where folate is a little, let's take an example. So, we could take vitamin A, vitamin C, or folate, but let's take folate because it's a little chemical which we don't make. We're not capable of making it. And it's like a tool. It's like a pneumatic hammer that you get from the rental store for a project at the house. What I mean is, you can't make it yourself. You have to consume it from something. And it comes from nuts and seeds and beets and leafy vegetables, some other things, some beans. Not all beans are pollinator dependent. Some beans self-pollinate, but all the rest of those are pollinator dependent plants.
Hmm.
And that's the source in the world of folate. If you look in the developed world, the more complex economies, the rate of folate deficiency is between 2 and 5%. If you look at it in all parts of the developed world, depends on the diet, but it can be between 17 and 70%. A huge portion of the people will have just anemia, but every pregnant woman, every woman of childbearing age should have sufficient folate in their diet, because if they don't, then as the central nervous system is forming, then you can have children that die in utero, or they can have birth defects, including serious ones that are caused lifelong disability. Or if the defect is at the base of the spine, maybe it's a child who can't walk but is otherwise ready to thrive. But that's what happens if you don't have enough folate. And that's what happens when plants aren't pollinated sufficiently. And so when we look at that spectrum of the diet, that is those micronutrients that are pollinator dependent, those are the things which we need to focus on. because that loss of vitamin A, vitamin C, folate, and the other micronutrients will have consequences not just on the mortality, not just on infant mortality, but on people's ability to thrive and have energy and go about their days and their lives. And that drags down economies in nations of the world, not just individuals.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting to me, I guess. I've traveled quite a bit in the less developed world, in especially in the Asian subcontinent, but also Mexico extensively. And I think of these indigenous diets; they tend to be rich in rice and beans,
Right.
or other legumes.
Yep.
And so, are you suggesting though that humans can't have adequate nutrition on a diet of rice and beans?
No, the rice and beans is fantastic for the protein content, and there'll be folate in those beans, but there's lots of other micronutrients that are entirely deficient in that
Mm.
diet.
Hmm.
And then so that's where yeah, you have to look at the spectrum of things that we require in order to grow a child, and then that child to grow up in the world and become successful as a human, that are going to be absolutely threatened if we lose pollinators.
Gotcha. So yeah, I think Western society is just still waking up to the crisis in invertebrate population. Scientists have been ringing the bell for a while now, and so luckily now we do have robust data demonstrating that this is a real crisis, and we need to do something about it. And surely it's tied to habitat. When you convert here in the Midwest, right, the vast majority of the landscape has been converted to agriculture, and it was wet prairie or oak woodlands and savanna, before Europeans came to North America. And it's a huge percent of the landscape.
Right.
Illinois was 90% prairie,
You know.
and now it's corn and beans,
Right.
unless the ground is too hilly or too wet, which is very little of the land. It's just a sea of corn and beans, and that's just not friendly, right, to most insects.
Aesthetically, it grows on you. And I lived in Iowa for a bunch of years and loved it. Loved to take a nice bike ride through that. But
Yeah.
I worked with the School of the Environment at Middlebury College in Yunnan, China, which is one of the most biodiverse regions of the world. But China has grown its agricultural productivity every year by 12% since 1974. Every year, every 8 years, they add 100%. And they
Wow.
don't have Illinois. They don't have Nebraska. They don't have a breadbasket. And what are the consequences in terms of biodiversity? And you pointed it out, it's not adequately studied. Do we know what the rate of losses are? When there's 100,000 species of pollinator and only maybe 80,000 of them have been named, how do you measure something that's never been identified yet as a species? It's really difficult. You want to make sure when you're making claims about the importance of fighting for something that you got it, that you have the solid science to back it up. And so we need to, what we end up doing is going through historical records and comparing historical records. But you're right, they've been calling about, E.O. Wilson has been talking about this since the early 70s about biodiversity and what a crisis was looming. And so our species has been so successful. The first time we reached 1 billion people was the year 1800. And then we reached 2 billion people by 1930. Took 130 years to make the second billion. Now we make another billion people every 12 and a half years. And that's extraordinary, and it's unprecedented in the history of our time on this planet. And it's got consequences, and those include the energy consequences that the folks in the renewable sector are dealing with. But it also has consequences on our basically crowding out other species. And that's where we're at. We're right there at that cusp where it's addressable. If you could be in I'd love to be doing this from one of our fields, because it is so nourishing to be in one of the fields after installation and see something that was empty of pollinators alive with pollinators.
Yeah. So when you're talking to solar companies, though, what are the challenges that solar installers and long-term asset owners face when they want to do the right thing? Well, yeah, just what is that discussion like, and what are the considerations for solar companies?
So the biggest thing is that they have, the people, we were talking before we started about the people in the sector. There is just sort of an admirable uh, high-mindedness and at the same time a very practical sense of project management and the movement of electrons. They're wonky as hell on that, but they're also not in the oil sector. There's a sort of idealism, and there's all these things that the hoops you have to jump through to get a project appeal. I think every state has them. If you're going to cut down that tree, you have to survey it for bats, and that's going to cost you $28,000. Well, you could install the whole field for pollinators for that, you know, but you've got so many things you have to do. There isn't necessarily margin left for the things you'd like to do. And so this costs more at the front end than just turf grass. It just does. The seed costs more, and getting to clean soil is a start. If you ever just tried to do wildflowers, it's not very encouraging. You have to get to clean soils. And much of this teaching comes from the tall grass prairie restoration, where that's the most analogous activity. But
Mhm.
if you're successful, which I could go on and on about, if you're successful in establishing this habitat, then you've got something which is going to be much lower on the maintenance cost moving forward, because you only have to mow, if you have to mow at all, depending on the front panel height, you only have to mow once a season at the 60 inches in the front edge of that panel. And the rest of it will be low growing enough it won't ever shade a panel. And if you have higher panel heights, you never have to mow it. But every other year at the end of season, long past the lifespan of the critters, you should probably mow it just to keep the woody plants from getting in and something unsuccessful after something successful. But it is something where the maintenance costs year by year going forward, and certainly the carbon costs of not mowing are much lower going forward. And so by the end of your 25-year lease, you've more than made back that installation. And some states are actually incentivizing this to make it even more feasible financially for solar developers.
Mike, one of the cool things that we discovered with pollinator friendly habitat is that the seed costs are on the front end are actually lower, because you don't require as many pounds of seed for the pollinator friendly mix as you do with the turf grass. So I think we're still learning, but I think developers and installers should know that it can be cheaper on the installation side. Now, the maintenance is another matter. I don't know when, and again, it does take at least 3 years to get these more diverse seed mixes established. You will have to do either mechanical treatment, selective weeding, selective weed eating, cutting, and possibly selective chemical use. So it does need a watchful eye, right? Because weeds, just here in the Midwest, weeds are a major challenge. The soil is so rich, and the weeds are so aggressive, and they get really big. We have a solar field here in at the University of Illinois, Solar Farm One, that the weeds started growing through the array, and the community started complaining to the university because the installer wasn't doing adequate maintenance on the array. And farmers, of course, are very sensitive to this, as well as our rural communities here. And so you have to really be careful with these things. On the upside, if you do get the pollinator mix established, it's totally aesthetically pleasing to the human eye.
Right.
Um, so I mean, hopefully, I can imagine that some people might think that there's weeds growing when it's actually by design pollinator friendly mix. But I don't
Right.
know if you have anything to say about that stuff.
So I do, and just to say, each site has its own things that are going to make, it always depends like what you have there. And so some of our more aggressive weeds that we have are things that might be biennial and need to be knocked down for a few years before you even start. So the first principle, I believe, is trying to start with clean soil. Almost every time we do something, it's cover cropped for a year in order to try and get control of the site before you
Mhm.
install. So we don't treat with chemicals at all, and we don't just put down seed after one tilling. It's almost always several tillings and then a cover crop.
Hmm.
and then a mowing of that cover crop, because you'll have things in the seed bed, curly dock and ragweed that have been sitting there for 30 to 70 years, just waiting to be turned into the sun, and boom, up they'll come, put out 60,000 seeds apiece and dominate the site. And so if you have parsnip, which is one of our, 80-inch tall, aggressive plants, or sword thistle, I mean, each region will have its devils to deal with, and they're almost admirable if I didn't spend so much of my life struggling with them. The way they're able to succeed and take every inch of open space. If you open a soil, that's just sort of nature despises that vacuum. But if you don't deal with that, but on the front end, before you install, succession will happen in the form of opportunists and perhaps invasives. There may be native opportunists, but perhaps invasives that will be all you've got to show for your effort. And it's that serious. It's something where we believe it's like baking bread. There's nothing to it. You just have to do exactly the right steps at exactly the right time, and it'll come out beautifully every time. But there's something with each field that's good. Yes, your soils are different for each space, particularly up where I am. It's so variable. In 5 miles, you'll see a completely different soil characteristics and plant community. And so it's really different every time. And we are 6 years in and still learning like crazy,
Yeah.
and still struggling sometimes.
Yeah, so there's a tremendous need for local knowledge of what works and what doesn't, and then codifying this and making it available on a broad basis. And we're grateful to organizations like you mentioned, Rob Davis, and now we have the American Solar Grazing Association and Lexi Hain, that is doing just that. They're creating this codification and websites which are just tremendous resources. And then organizations like NREL and the DOE are also getting in the game and studying pollinator friendly practices. So there is a lot of research going on now. Well, Mike, what else should developers and installers? Okay, you're there embedded in Vermont, and it sounds like you're working fairly locally, but let's talk a little more regionally. Of course,
Yeah,
the Northeast is on fire with solar development. New York
we
State and Massachusetts,
yeah
now Maine, New Jersey. I mean, it is a
yeah
really robust
we're,
growth
we're not new
economy.
we're not in New Jersey, but we're in those other states, and yet, as I said, it's our ambition to have this happening everywhere, but that have it happening with some standards. And so, just as you say, there's a way that the biggest competition I have is not someone else doing this. It's somebody greenwashing and just throwing down seed and said we did it. I believe that the way it should be done is with our mark. We're contractually obligated to survey for plant diversity and abundance and pollinator diversity and abundance. And that's part of our contract. And if it isn't there, we're required to fix it. And I believe that kind of rigor, it's great to have a scorecard before you install, but I also like it's some fields we maintain, but if we're not maintaining it, I like to be able to have a contract where I will spend once or twice a season a survey to say, look at that, you've got a patch of this there, knock that down now, or you'll have nothing else in 3 years. That's where you can have, victory, defeat can overcome you at the last minute because you just didn't attend to what's there. And so those principles of establishing this is not as easy as just putting down seed, and the work it takes to get to a clean soil is the largest portion of my costs. And that's the kind of rigor we need to do in our neck of the woods, or you just don't get very, very pretty habitat. There's times when the field is so easy, you think, God, if it was only like this every time. But nature's not that way, and plants have too many opportunities to count on it being that way.
So what services exactly does Be the Change offer?
So we are generally looking at this as something where we will install and do that for you as a turnaround turnkey type service, pollinator habitat. But we also do a lot of consulting. I travel all over the region. You were saying St. Louis. I was up to St. Louis and other parts of the country to talk to people and to talk about how this is best done. And we have On other fields where we not only build the field, we build a pollinator habitat, we maintain the pollinator habitat. And so that varies from one developer's choice to another and who ends up ultimately owning it. But if we're not the ultimate maintenance person, we like to have somebody or someone designated, a botanist, who understands what they're looking at, to survey that site once or twice a season. Even a 600-acre site, just to have somebody walk that site, or else you'll miss it. You'll miss something coming in, and that will be even drifting in from the fence line. That'll be all that's there in 3 years.
Yeah, I can see from your website that you're also interested in honey, and honeybees are a mixed blessing because they do sting. So let's talk a little bit about that. What are the considerations if you want to grow honey on your solar farm?
So this is something where there are a lot of folks who are doing honey and solar, and I would say it's not an emphasis of ours. Of our 30 fields, we have one with some honeybees in it. I love honeybees. I love caring for them, but the emphasis is on biodiversity, and that there's 275 native bee species in our neck of the woods, and 130 butterfly species, and 1,200 moths, and vastly many more beetles. And these are all, not all are important pollinators, but many are, and particularly flies. And so looking at a diverse habitat where you understand, my favorite thing about this, Tim, is every year I learn a few more pollinators that I can spot on the wing, and I know what they are, and I will know then what their shelter needs are, what their pests are. And so every one of the butterflies has a larval host species. And so if you're not providing that larval host species, they can't grow their babies, and they're not going to be nourished by your habitat. And so the emphasis on honeybees is not at all where we're at, because it's a non-native. And in fact, it even vectors diseases into the native bee community, leaves viruses on the blossoms. But it's something where it's a workhorse, and as a domesticated animal, it can be moved around in boxes, and they're just damn charming, and I love the honey. And so we do have honey, and we do have some bees in one of our fields, but I would say the emphasis is on the diversity of pollinators and how we create habitat that nourishes them.
Well, I love the emphasis on native species. That is so important. And so, and as you pointed out, it's so not about just throwing down the right seed mix. It's so much about the process of how you treat the soil before, during, and after, and that's completely non-trivial.
Right.
So, we mentioned the Rob Davis, and I'm going to put Rob's website, Fresh Energy, on the screen here in a second, and ASGA, the American Solar Grazing Association, so our listeners can increase their knowledge and resources. But what else should developers and installers be thinking about and learning about?
So another opportunity is whatever planting you're required to do for screening a site along for visual lines, because we have sites where we've just been advisor on what they selected for plant screening. And you think of one of these, trees that you see flowering now in the spring, that's a very large garden by surface area, if it's a good sized tree. And so, we try and get to screening to be much less of a bunch of cedars, screening something that must clearly be industrial behind it, and something much more in the vernacular of what a hedgerow looks like, with different sizes of different types of trees. And yes, some are evergreen and some are not. And there are a lot of those species that are not, that are pollinator friendly trees and shrubs. And so that's where we try and think of this as like a slow motion fireworks display, where at every moment in the season, you have things coming into bloom. And that's the opportunity that you have, not just in the space underneath and around the panels, but in the space where you're screening.
Yeah, there are zones within a solar project that one has to think about. There's inside the array or inside the fence, and then there's the perimeter, there's the screening, the buffer, and every project is going to be slightly different because, let's face it, every authority having jurisdiction, or AHJ as we call them in the industry, has different rules and regulations about these things. you can get away with using native plants to screen your project. You just have to be creative and work with the right ecological consultants. So finding those consultants is a journey. What do you have to say about that? How accessible is that information?
I think it's actually here's a source that our friends in the bird loving community, the Audubon folks, their friends eat our friends, but we're cool with that. They have great listings on their sites of what would be native to your part of the country in terms of trees and shrubs. And it really would be no more effort than to look at that and say, okay, where am I in the country? What's native to this region? And where can I source them? And what I'd say is also the sourcing is growing as we've gone from our very first years to many different opportunities to source it more and more locally and that kind of stuff. It's still something where I'm sure demand will outstrip supply, but this is where I think as long as we are, you know, I think as long as we're building a demand, then the supply should probably rise with it.
I'm so happy you mentioned the Audubon Society, because I would fully agree that that is a wonderful resource for plant lists. And I think it's a both and though. I think you really need local consultants. What I did at Continental is I started a working group on pollinator friendly solar. And
Very
so
cool.
these the seed companies and the vegetation engineering companies or ecological consulting firms became active, and that's how we identified them. And then there's the landscaping companies as well, and there are many now that specialize in native plants.
Right.
You also mentioned earlier in the show, ecological restoration and uh, the connection between these two. There is a strong connection between the ecological restoration community and pollinator friendly solar vegetation. So that's important.
One of the things we're trying to create as a way of the question, how do we scale this? Is we're trying to create a sensibility that as an owner of real estate, whether it's your home, apartment, or your office, that you might take this as a sort of responsibility since you get to enjoy this space, which is my office here, that you have a responsibility to offset its footprint, not the carbon footprint, but the actual literal footprint. So we have this pollinator offset footprint notion where we go to a company and say, go to the bakery downtown, go to the nail shop and say, you've got 800 square feet here for 11 cents a square foot. We'll create 800 square feet of pollinator habitat. And you know what? People say yes. And so it's interesting because we started that last November. We've got about 200 organizations and individuals who have offset their footprint. And we're trying to get this to be something that the people in Vermont collectively do. And we're trying to actually we have 251 towns in the state of Vermont. So we have an effort now to get each of the 251 towns to take an acre that is in a municipal or school space and take it offline. They've been mowing it every year at not zero cost, and it's just a lawn where we create, maybe we'll keep a lawn path through it, but we'll otherwise create a pollinator habitat. And then we'll go to the bakery and the nail shop and we'll ask them to offset their footprint. And there'll be a little sign next to that acre that says, here we offset our footprint. And 11 cents a square foot is what it costs, because if you look at that, that's 43,560. It's around 4,800 an acre. And you can definitely make an acre of pollinator habitat for $4,800 plus your overhead. So that's the notion that we're trying to take. And if we get companies and individuals to offset their footprint, then every landscape business in America will have a little pollinator arm. And then we'll have a problem with supply for seed and plants, but that will grow alongside, because I'm sure the people who grow seeds and plants would be delighted to have more demand.
Yes, they will. Well, I want to walk through a couple of websites on our way out here, and then I need to make a couple of announcements, and then we will emphasize how people can reach you, Mike. And we'll start with yours. That's bethechangehoney.com. And I did show this on screen earlier in the show. And then the Audubon Society, audubon.org. They have a section on habitat when you go to the birds and guides. and then the Xerces Society, XERCES
Yes.
Society, which is the Society for Invertebrate Conservation. And obviously, it's all about habitat and and how you manage that habitat. And then we've talked about Rob Davis at Fresh Energy. He is the director of the Center for Pollinators in Energy. He has been on the show here, so you can check that out. And if you just Google Rob Davis or YouTube Rob Davis, you'll find that he's given many, many talks on this subject. He is a national and internationally recognized thought leader on the subject. Then we have ASGA, the American Society of American Solar Grazing Association, sorry, at solargrazing.org. Lexi Hain will be coming on the show here in the next couple of months. Looking forward to that. And you might think, oh, they're all about grazing, but when you go to the solar seed mix page, you see that they've got Fuzz and Buzz Mix Standard and Fuzz and Buzz Mix Premium. So they have some really useful information. And then finally, you can reach all of my content at cesnrg.com/podcast. And I am Tim Montague, your host there. You can reach out to me on Twitter also, TG Montague on Twitter. We just recently did a program with my brother, Ty Montague, where we talk about growth for the greater good and how companies can find their higher purpose, but also bringing you authors like Peter Kelly Detweiler and The Energy Switch. He has a wonderful new book out called The Energy Switch, where he talks about the energy transition and how the grid is being democratized. Solar economics. We've been doing a series with David Loomis on solar economics here. Recently, we talked about the Path to 100 legislation that's working its way through Illinois. And so check us out at cesnrg.com/podcast. Please give us a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and share it with your friends. We really appreciate that. And the more professionals and lay people that learn about all the knowledge and best practices of the solar industry, the better off the industry is going to be. I want to thank you, Mike, for coming on the show today. What a pleasure to get to know you a little bit. And if there's a specific way that our listeners can reach you besides your website, how is that?
So I think that's the best way is through the website, and be delighted to talk to anybody at any length, as you could probably tell. And it's one of the things that we've been talking to a lot of folks around the country more and more, and also traveling to consult and look at fields together, because I love it. Thanks for the opportunity to be on, Tim. I really appreciate it.
Well, let's grow pollinator friendly solar, Mike. Take care.
Yeah.